You know, this is one of the questions that I certainly get asked all the time, and I get drug in front of Congress and asked this: are the regulations adequate? It's a really, really hard thing for a citizen to answer. I think you can educate yourself as a citizen enough about the rules and the regulations that you can have an opinion about whether the regulations themselves could be written differently and maybe be more adequate. It's really hard to even have much of an opinion about whether the regulators are dealing with those regulations enough to say whether they're doing an adequate job. But there are some things that you can look at that can help inform your brain about those things. I think we went through this pretty much. I just threw these in here in case anybody else didn't cover them, and for the most part they were covered. The regulations ultimately come from the U.S. Congress. They set the minimum federal statutes. PHMSA then takes those statutes and interprets them into rules through their rulemaking process. FERC, who is often talked about, you know, lots of people don't even consider FERC to be a pipeline safety agency. They're more of a siting, rate-setting agency, but certainly, you know, if they allow a pipeline to come through a community, that has safety implications, and they have a lot to do with about the environmental safety of the way pipelines are constructed through communities. And then the states, through, you just heard, they can get certified by PHMSA to take over some of the inspections and authority of pipelines, and they can pass stronger laws on the intrastate pipelines. And even local government, and you're going to hear more about this tomorrow, has some control. They can't set rules and regulations about pipeline safety. You can't tell a pipeline company you're going to put, we want you to put more valves in our community, but you certainly, through your planning, zoning, and permitting authority, have some control over the way land use occurs around pipelines, which is a safety issue. We already heard about, you know, who regulates the federal government versus the state here. This slide actually, I think, names, at least in the Salt Lake Valley here, which pipelines are being regulated by who. And for the most part, the feds are regulating the bigger pipelines, and the state of Utah does Questar. So how can the public know if regulations are adequate? Well, there's a lot of things you can look at. You can look at the incident record. We looked at, you know, I think one of the charts I put up there said there was had been only 3 incidents in the last 10 years on gas transmission pipelines in the whole state of Utah. That's something that tells you something about how well things are working. You can look at lessons from previous failures and whether those lessons are being acted on. Integrity management was a reaction to failures, and that's a huge new set of regulations that's kicked in. We're hearing now, because of failures in the last few years, the whole idea of automated valves and better leak detection, and you heard about that earlier. Damage prevention is a huge issue, and you know, one of the companies this morning suggested that the Utah Public Service Commission might want to look at up in the enforcement of damage prevention, because they thought there could be stronger rules there. And you know, we heard the issue of older lines. And the other thing is just, are new threats being identified and acted upon also? The other question is about how can the public know if pipeline companies are actually following the regulations. That's really the regulator's job, but if you take that whole trust but verify thing that we heard from NTSB to heart, you know, the public ought to be able to get some kind of a sense of whether the pipeline companies are doing the right thing. Again, the incident record goes a long way. If a company's not having any incidents, they're doing something right. You can compare a company's record to national averages. That'll give you some sense, and like I pointed out earlier, there's some hazards in that, trying to do that. You can look at their enforcement and inspection records, and I'm going to show you some of that here in a second. You can see if they are going beyond the minimum requirements. You have to really get to know a company. Like I was saying, you know, I was out to dinner with some of the companies last night. I've got to know some. I know folks like Larry here, so I know what Williams does compared to what the minimum federal regulations. There's a reason they call them minimum federal regulations. It's the minimum you're required to do. That doesn't prevent a company from doing a whole lot more than that. Some companies do, and some companies get by with the minimum federal regulations. So, but how the public knows that is only by getting to know the company. At least at this point, I don't know another way. And then if they're just actively engaged in programs to improve safety, and you heard from the industry groups, both Peter and Larry today, talking about how some of the major pipeline organizations have really taken some of the incidents of the last couple of years to heart and are really trying to push forward on some new commitments to safety and trying to expand that. Well, you have to look at your local companies now then to see if they're part of those initiatives. How can the public know if regulators are providing adequate oversight? Some of the same things. Incident records are an indication. Enforcement and inspection records are now online for the feds real easily. It's more difficult for the states. Some states are real good about that. Some states aren't. That may be something you want to look at here in Utah. Do you want your Public Service Commission to provide more information so you can have a sense of some of these things going on? Have states went beyond the minimum regulations? There are minimum regulations, again, for interstate pipelines. States can set stronger regulations if they see there's a problem in their state they could address. I don't know, the national NAPS, or the National Association of Pipeline Safety Representatives, which are all the state regulators, recently put out a paper because they were kind of under the gun, I think, because of the San Bruno and some of the fallout on state regulators from that. So they put out a report showing how many states have gone way beyond the federal regulations, and they were very proud of how most states have done that. As you just heard, Utah has chosen not to do anything beyond the minimum federal regulations. And then there's the whole slew of NTSB recommendations that really deal with coming up with meaningful metrics, so both the regulators will know what the companies are doing, and hopefully the public will know what both groups are doing in a measurable sort of way, so we'll have some sort of sense. There are some things you can look at. Here's some enforcement stuff from the Utah Public Service Commission. These are probable violations and compliance actions. So this is for the last 10 years, you know, how many, when they were out inspecting companies, how many probable violations they found, how many of those violations were corrected in the years, if there was compliance actions taken, the number of penalties, and then how many fines were assessed. So that'll tell you something, and you can compare this to other states, because this may be normal, it may not be normal. I mean, just looking at this, I have a question for why we were finding so many probable violations here, and then all of a sudden in 2006 it dropped off. There's probably an easy answer to that. I don't know what the answer is. Al can, we're all getting up on Al. And then you look at all the zeros in this. Lots of states, there's a lot of states that seem not to believe in fining people. They think working cooperatively works better than fining people. There's other states that believe in fines, and you'll see big fines, and there's states in the middle. You know, just because there's zeros here, that may not have anything to do with the philosophy of Utah. I don't know that one way or another. And then there's federal enforcement actions. You can look at what the feds did in kind of the same time period. And I broke it out by the specific pipelines, because when you look at the federal data, you can actually look at specific companies and find out what they were doing. So you can see that, you know, in Kern River, there was 4 cases initiated and 4 cases resolved, and there basically were no penalties for Questar or Kern River. Tesoro, who runs a few pipelines up around the refineries, and Chevron, you know, this was a lot of what happened here in Salt Lake City. So that gives you somewhat of a sense of how the agencies and how the companies are doing. And I think the other thing that I just wanted to kind of close on is, if we really want to include the public as that third leg of the stool for pipeline safety and being the trust but verify branch of that maybe, is we really need to try to dream up better ideas for meaningful public involvement. One way that Washington State tried to do it after the Bellingham incident is they formed statewide as a governor-appointed pipeline safety advisory committee made up of the public. The industry is there as non-voting members, but then there's public and local government members, and we get together every other month to just review pipeline safety in the state of Washington. And then there's federal technical committees. That's what that blurry picture is, which is another opportunity right now that kind of involves all 3 legs of that stool that has to revolve any rules that PHMSA brings forward. So you have the industry and the public and regulators looking at that too. So we need to dream up more opportunities for like that. And that, I think, was my last slide. So if anybody has questions on who regulates or how adequate we do that, we'd be glad to take them.